Every week I receive 2 or 3 emails asking me whether Jesus existed as a human being. When I started getting these emails some years ago now, I thought the question was rather peculiar, and I did not take it seriously. Of course Jesus existed. Everyone knows he existed, don't they? But the questions kept coming, and soon I began to wonder, why are so many people asking? My wonder only increased when I learned that I myself was being quoted in some circles, misquoted rather, as saying that Jesus never existed. I decided to look into the matter. I discovered to my surprise an entire body of literature devoted to the question of whether or not there was a real man Jesus. I was surprised because I'm trained as a scholar of the New Testament and early Christianity, and for 30 years I have written extensively on the historical Jesus, the Gospels, the early Christian movement, and the history of the Church's first 300 years. Like all New Testament scholars, I've read thousands of books and articles in English and other European languages on Jesus, the New Testament, and early Christianity. But I was almost completely unaware, as are most of my colleagues in the field, of this body of skeptical literature. These sundry books and articles, not to mention websites, are of varying quality. Some of them rival the Da Vinci Code in their passion for conspiracy and the shallowness of their historical knowledge, not just of the New Testament and early Christianity, but of ancient religions generally, and even more broadly, the ancient world. But a couple of bona fide scholars, not professors teaching religious studies in universities, but scholars nonetheless, and at least one of them with a PhD in the field of New Testament, have taken this position and written about it. Their books may not be known to most of the general public interested in questions related to Jesus, the Gospels, or the early Christian Church, but they do occupy a noteworthy niche as a small but loud minority voice. Once you tune into this voice, you quickly learn just how persistent and vociferous it can be. And the voice is being heard loud and clear in some places. Even a quick internet search reveals how influential such radical skepticism has been in the past and how rapidly it is spreading even now. For decades, it was the dominant view in countries such as the Soviet Union. Yet more striking, it appears to be the majority view in some regions of the West today, including some parts of Scandinavia. The authors of this skeptical literature understand themselves to be mythicists. That is, those who believe that Jesus is a myth. When mythicists use the term myth, they often seem to mean simply a story that has no historical basis, a history-like narrative that in fact did not happen. In this sense, Jesus is a myth because even though there are plenty of ancient stories about him, they're not historical. His life and teachings were invented by early storytellers. He never really lived. Those who do not think Jesus existed are frequently militant in their views and remarkably adept at countering evidence that to the rest of the civilized world seems compelling and even unanswerable. But these writers have answers, and the smart ones among them need to be taken seriously, if for no other reason than to show why they cannot be right about their major contention. The reality is that whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. It's striking that virtually everyone who has spent all the years needed to attain the necessary qualifications is convinced that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. This is not a piece of evidence, but if nothing else, it should give one pause. In the field of biology, evolution may be just a theory, as some politicians painfully point out, but it is the theory subscribed to, for good reason, by every real scientist in every established university in the Western world. Still, as is clear from the avalanche of sometimes outraged postings on all the relevant internet sites, there's simply no way to convince conspiracy theorists that the evidence for their position is too thin to be convincing, and that the evidence for a traditional view is thoroughly persuasive. Anyone who chooses to believe something contrary to evidence that an overwhelming majority of people find overwhelmingly convincing, whether it involves the fact of the Holocaust, the landing on the moon, the assassination of presidents, or even a presidential place of birth, will not be convinced. Simply will not be convinced. And so with this book, I do not expect to convince anyone in that boat. What I do hope is to convince genuine seekers who really want to know, how we know that Jesus did exist, as virtually every scholar of antiquity, of biblical studies, of classics, and of Christian origins in the country, and in fact in the Western world, agrees. Many of these scholars have no vested interest in the matter. As it turns out, I myself do not either. I'm not a Christian, and I have no interest in promoting a Christian cause or a Christian agenda. I'm an agnostic with atheist leanings, and my life and views of the world would be approximately the same whether or not Jesus existed. My beliefs would vary little. The answer to the question of Jesus' historical existence will not make me more or less happy, content, hopeful, likable, rich, famous, or immortal. But, as a historian, I think evidence matters, and the past matters. And for anyone to whom both evidence and the past matter, a dispassionate consideration of the case makes it quite plain. Jesus did exist. It is a complete myth, in the mythicist sense, that Romans kept detailed records of everything, and that as a result, we are inordinately well informed about the world of Roman Palestine, and should expect then to hear about Jesus if he really lived. If Romans kept such records, where are they? We certainly don't have any. Think of everything we do not know about the reign of Pontius Pilate as governor of Judea. We know from the Jewish historian Josephus that Pilate ruled for 10 years between 26 and 36 CE. It would be easy to argue that he was the single most important figure for Roman Palestine for the entire length of his rule. And what records from this decade do we have from his reign? What Roman records of his major accomplishments, his daily itinerary, the decrees he passed, the laws he issued, the prisoners he put on trial, the death warrants he signed, his scandals, his interviews, his judicial proceedings? We have none. Nothing at all. I might press the issue further. What archaeological evidence do we have about Pilate's rule in Palestine? We have some coins that were issued during his reign. One would not expect coins about Jesus, since he didn't issue any. And we have only one, fragmentary inscription discovered in Caesarea Maritima in 1961 that indicates that Pilate was the Roman prefect. Nothing else. And what writings do we have from him? Not a single word. Does that mean he didn't exist? No. He's mentioned in several passages in Josephus and in the writings of the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo and in the Gospels. He certainly existed, even though, like Jesus, we have no records from his day or writings from his hand. And what is striking is that we have far more information about Pilate than about any other governor of Judea in Roman times. And so it's a modern myth to say that we have extensive Roman records from antiquity that surely would have mentioned someone like Jesus had he existed. It's also worth pointing out that Pilate is mentioned only in passing in the writing of the one Roman historian, Tacitus, who does name him. Moreover, that happens to be in a passage that also refers to Jesus in the Annals of Rome, Book 15. I might add that our principal source of knowledge about Jewish Palestine in the days of Jesus comes from from the historian Josephus, a prominent aristocratic Jew who was extremely influential in the social and political affairs of his day. And how often is Josephus mentioned in Greek and Roman sources of his own day, the 1st century CE? Never. Think of an analogy. If a historian 60 years from now were to write up a history of the American South in, say, the 20th and 21st centuries, is he likely to mention Zlatko Plešák? Zlatko's not here, I hope. Zlatko is my brilliant colleague who teaches courses in ancient philosophy, Gnosticism, varieties of early Christianity, and other subjects. Would they mention Zlatko? Almost certainly not. What does that prove? Technically speaking, it proves nothing. But it does suggest either that Zlatko never existed, or that he did not make a huge impact on the political, social, or cultural life of the South. As it turns out, Zlatko does exist. I bought him dinner last night. So, if he is not mentioned in a future history of the South, it will no doubt be because he did not make a big impact on the South. To show he existed, one would have to look at other evidence. For example, copies of the 2 books he has written. And unlike the 1st century, we have the mass production and distribution of books plus libraries to house them in. If he is rarely mentioned, it is barely relevant to the question of his existence. It's possible that he simply made too little impact, just like the overwhelming mass of people who lived in the Roman Empire of the first century. So for the bulk of the book, I look at the evidence, from the New Testament Gospels especially, and from the writings of the Apostle Paul. And I devote a chapter to two key arguments that pretty much cinch the case that Jesus must have lived, one of which is easy to summarize. The Apostle Paul actually knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter, as he tells us, and he knew Jesus' brother, James. And as I argue, if Jesus didn't exist, you would think that his brother would know it. And there's actually one other argument that's too complicated to go into that cinches it, that Jesus almost certainly existed. I want to just end by reading a page or so on one of the common arguments used by mythicists about Jesus. One of the most widely asserted claims found in the mythicist literature is that Jesus was an invention of the early Christians who had been deeply influenced by the prevalent notion of a dying and rising God, as found throughout pagan religions of antiquity. The theory behind this claim is that people in many ancient religions worshipped gods who died and rose again. Osiris, Attis, Tammuz, Heracles, Melkart, Elshmun, Baal, and so on. Originally, the theory goes, these gods were connected with vegetation and were worshipped in fertility cults. Just as every year the crops die in winter but then come back to life in the spring, so too with the gods who are associated with the crops. They die when the crops do and go to the underworld, but then they revive with the crops and reappear on earth raised from the dead. They are worshipped then as dying, rising deities. Jesus, in this view, was the Jewish version of the pagan fertility deity, invented by Jews as a dying and rising god. Only later did some of the devotees of this Jewish deity historicize his existence and begin to claim that he was in fact a divine human who had once lived on earth, who had died and then rose again. This view of the invention of Jesus is nearly ubiquitous among mythicists. There are, however, major problems with this view that Jesus was originally invented as a dying, rising god, modeled on the dying and rising gods of the pagan world. First, there are serious doubts about whether there were, in fact, dying, rising gods in the pagan world, and if there were, whether they were anything at all like the dying, rising Jesus. And the answer probably is no, there were not gods like that.
As my guest is Bart Ehrman. Ehrman chairs the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His new book is about the three people who may have been Jesus' most important followers: Simon Peter, the Apostle Paul, and Mary Magdalene. Now, I don't need to tell our listeners that the Da Vinci Code has been adapted into a movie that will be opening soon with Tom Hanks. Now, in the Da Vinci Code, Mary Magdalene is portrayed as being married to Jesus and having a sexual relationship with him. What inspires that part of the Da Vinci Code?
I think what inspires that part of the Da Vinci Code is the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was written in the early 1980s, which has exactly this point, that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married and had a daughter, and that this daughter became ultimately Mary and the daughter are in France, and this girl, Sarah, ends up becoming the founder of the Merovingian dynasty in France.
This is a novel?
The authors of this book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, claimed that in fact it was a factual account based on secret papers that had been uncovered. But in fact, it's only loosely covered in the nonfiction section of the New York Times. In fact, it's a fictional account that they claim is factual, and that Dan Brown claims is factual. But in actual fact, there's nothing to back it up. I mean, there are no ancient sources of any kind whatsoever that indicate that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene or that they had sex or made babies. This is just a part of the modern imagination.
Is this the book that where the author sued Dan Brown, saying that the Da Vinci Code was plagiarized?
It was a very strange court case in a way, because both parties wanted to claim that the information found in both books was factual. not fiction. But I mean, if these are facts, it's hard to plagiarize a fact. I mean, facts are facts, and so this created a rather strange scenario for the lawsuit. And eventually, Dan Brown won the lawsuit because they decided that, in fact, there was no evidence that he had plagiarized it. But if you read the two accounts, it's quite clear this is where he's getting his information from.
So having studied both the New Testament and the Gnostic Gospels, what's your comprehension now of Mary Magdalene's place in the Jesus story and the development of Christianity?
My sense is that Mary Magdalene probably was one of the people who followed Jesus around during his travels. He had more followers than just his 12 disciples. He had other men and women who followed him, and Mary Magdalene was one of them. And she evidently went with him the last week of his life to Jerusalem with a group of other people, men and women. And she probably saw him get crucified and saw where he got buried. And I think she probably was one of the women who went to the tomb on the third day and found that it was empty and started saying that Jesus must have been raised from the dead. So my read on it is that Mary very well may be the one who started Christianity. To that extent, she's extremely important for the history of our form of civilization. But saying that she's the one who found the empty tomb isn't the same as saying that she's the one who was married to Jesus and had sex with him and made babies. I mean, those are two very different things, and there's no evidence, in my view, that they had a particularly close or intimate relationship. But what makes her important is her role in starting Christianity.
You know, if you take away the part of the story where Mary's actually a prostitute and Jesus kind of cleverly prevents other people from stoning her, it changes the story of Jesus too, because he's no longer that person who's friends with a prostitute and who discourages others from stoning her.
Well, that's right, except that there are other passages that suggest that Jesus did hang out with social outcasts. Of course, prostitutes would be in that group. That Jesus didn't associate with the high and mighty, the religious leaders, but with the lowly. The reason that he attracted people like that to his message is that he was proclaiming that God was soon going to intervene and overthrow the oppressive forces of this world and bring in a good kingdom in which there'd be equality, where there'd be where people who now are humbled would be exalted, and those who are exalted now would be humbled, and the first would be last and the last first. And this obviously was attractive to people who were humbled and lowly and oppressed, and women included. So that I think that's probably the sort of thing that would have drawn a woman like Mary Magdalene to his message.
I unfortunately get quoted as someone who thinks that Jesus didn't exist, which I think is really very strange because I've written an entire book on what Jesus said and did.
Okay.
and for him to say and do anything, he had to exist. So I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period. So, I'm not saying this as a believer. I'm not a believer. But as a historian, I'm just saying that you can't just kind of dismiss it and say, well, we don't know. You have to look at the evidence.